Hi, this is Dr. Mike Chupp, your host for the weekly podcast of the Christian Medical and Dental Associations, which we call CMDA Matters. And this is a special bonus edition of CMDA Matters. It's an interview that I did in 2020 with Dr. Rana, who's Vice President of Research and Apologetics at Reasons to Believe. We've gone back into the archives because Dr. Rana will be our special guest on August 14th in our ongoing educational partnership with Dallas Theological Seminary. We call that CMDA and DTS Dialogues, Healthcare and Theology, Learning Together. In this webinar, we will be discussing the topic of transhumanism. Joining Dr. Rana will be Dr. Bill Cheshire. He's a neurologist from the Mayo Clinic, Jacksonville, and also a prior CMDA Educator of the Year award winner. They'll be joined by Dr. Ben Mitchell, who's a bioethicist from Union University in Tennessee and senior fellow from the Center for Bioethics and Human Dignity in Chicago. Hosting this 90-minute webinar will be Executive Director of the Dallas Theological Seminary Center for Cultural Engagement, Dr. Darrell Bach. Well, my interview with Fuz in 2020 followed the release of his new book, Humans 2.0, Scientific, Philosophical, and Theological Perspectives on Transhumanism. We are releasing this bonus edition as a way to encourage you to register for that webinar in the middle of August just by going to cmda.org/DTS webinar. Now let's listen in as Fuz elaborates on a topic that keeps on hitting closer and closer to home as technology around the globe advances at a remarkable pace. Well, welcome, Dr. Rana from Reasons to Believe. You're the vice president of that organization started by, I believe, by Hugh Ross, was it not?
Hugh Ross was the founder of the organization, and we've been in existence probably 33, 34 years now. And
you took the position of vice president about 7 years ago or so?
Oh, actually, I've been with RTB 20 years and have been a vice president for almost that duration. So I've been around for a lot longer than I'd like to admit now.
So I can see why you've written a number of books while serving at Reasons to Believe. Who Was Adam? Creating Life in the Lab, The Cell's Design, and Dinosaur Blood and the Age of the Earth. So this book that we're going to discuss today certainly is not your first rodeo.
No, it's not. And in some respects, it's something very different than I've ever written about. I typically have focused on origin of life issues and issues relating to the origin of humanity. But this is, in some respects, a logical extension of the book Who Was Adam, which is about a scientific case for the biblical account of human origins, and a book called Creating Life in the Lab, which are attempts to use techniques in synthetic biology to create artificial, non-natural life forms. So in some respects, it's a logical extension of those two books,
Sure.
But on the other hand, it's something very different than I've ever done before.
I'll just tell our listeners it took me about 3 weeks to digest your book. I mean, I was pretty focused, and I learned a great deal about secular ethics, about transhumanism, posthumanism, in its history. So Humans 2.0 and the topic of transhumanism, can you just in a nutshell tell our listeners what transhumanism actually means?
This is an idea that is really a kind of a combination of science and technology, philosophy and theology. It's all kind of rolled into one. But the bottom line is that people that espouse the transhumanist vision see an obligation that we have as human beings to use science and technology to improve upon our biological makeup, to enhance our physical strength, our intellectual capabilities, our psychological well-being beyond our natural biological limits. The idea behind doing this is noble to some degree because they see this as a way to alleviate pain and suffering. They see the human body as inherently flawed, being the product of an evolutionary history. So they want to use science and technology to correct these flaws and going one step further to enhance our capabilities beyond our natural limits. But they also see this as a way to not only end pain and suffering, but to promote human flourishing and maybe to even attain some type of utopian future. And of course, one of the greatest enemies that we face as human beings is death. And so they see science and technology as the way to extend our life expectancy, maybe even attain some form of immortality. And so, in effect, what you see here is science and technology functioning as the mode or the means for salvation for not only the human species, but for individuals. And so this is where the movement takes on a very strong religious element or a religious flavor.
Certainly you and your co-author, Ken Samples, Fuzz, point out that one of your goals for this book is to explain to Christians, and including those physicians, those in healthcare, that we need to engage with those who are promoting this, because there's a lot in common that we have with transhumanists, including the gospel. Looking at the gospel, transhumanists have some goals that you point out in the book are laudable, that we can have some common ground with them. Talk to us about that.
My concern is that as Christians, we tend, when it comes to things like emerging biotechnologies, to either ignore those advances or to condemn them, but we really don't oftentimes do a good job of effectively engaging these ideas. And the point of the book really is to try to encourage Christians to see transhumanism as ultimately a golden opportunity to present the gospel. Because what transhumanists desire is really reflecting a deep need that every human being has. We want to see an end to pain and suffering. We want to see human beings flourish because we realize that the world is not the way that the world's supposed to be. And so transhumanists want to use science and technology to fulfill that ache that's in each of us. And they want a utopian future. They want some form of immortality. They recognize that death somehow isn't natural. They want hope. They want destiny. They want purpose. And this is, of course, what Christianity offers in the gospel. But, as Christians, we believe that the gospel is the true means by which we get salvation, the genuine place where our hope resides. And so the fact that transhumanism is exposing these needs really gives us an opportunity to step in if we are effective in terms of engaging transhumanism with a counter proposal, if you will, the one that's found in the person of Christ. So this is a golden opportunity to share the gospel, and I don't want the church to lose out on this opportunity because our culture is begging for what the gospel offers.
Fuzz, the cover of your book is just so well done. A robotic hand on the front cover. And it took me back to my high school years when Empire Strikes Back comes out and Luke Skywalker, has his hand chopped off and we're like all aghast. And then next scene, he's got this robotic hand and is able to be Luke again. Back in those days, it seems so far-fetched, but your book does a good job of going through cutting-edge technologies that are out there. Just talk to us briefly about some of those technologies that are amazing.
Yeah, well, one area that I find totally fascinating involves computer-brain interface technology, where people have discovered that the electrical activity in our brain can be marshaled to control machines, and we can actually receive electrical input from machines in our brains, and our brains can learn to process that input. So through the use of a computer-brain interface, it allows the communication between a brain and a machine. And this is absolutely fascinating because patients can learn through these computer-brain interfaces that can either be implanted in the brain, reside on the surface of the brain, or be external through things like EEG caps, can learn with their thoughts to control computer software, computer hardware, robotic prosthetic limbs, exoskeletons, neuroprosthetic types of devices. And so this is astounding breakthroughs that are happening where the preliminary preclinical type studies really indicate that within decades, we're going to probably have revolutionary treatments for people that are locked in, people that are quadriplegics, paraplegics, amputees. It's astounding in terms of these advances that are taking place where, that science fiction
Yes.
depiction that you described with Luke Skywalker is really becoming a reality before our very eyes. And this raises all kinds of very provocative questions about who are we as human beings? What does it mean to be a human person? Questions related to who should get access to this technology because it's going to be very expensive. But it's also very hopeful and transformative in terms of what that technology could translate into in terms of, really changing people's lives.
Well, your book, you spent a fair amount of time, which was so helpful to me. I've heard a lot about CRISPR technology and about gene editing, and I think for those who get the book, it will be a very great primer on gene editing. And this month, 35 years ago, Fuzz, I had my first medical-related job. I worked in a genetics lab at Indiana University for Dr. Hodes, who was looking at the autosomal dominant inherited Huntington's disease. And I was just a lab rat. I didn't know much at all about DNA or DNA sequencing, but in 1984, we were sequencing DNA and figuring out where the gene was for Huntington's disease. And reading your book and preparing for this interview, I got online, and lo and behold, this year in January, the FDA approved the first trials for a new vector to introduce a cassette of DNA, as they call it, into brain cells to try to halt the progression of Huntington's disease, a neurologic degeneration. So it's taken some time, but some actual applications for treating somatic cells, not germline cells, but somatic cells, which you point out in your book.
Yeah, and this is the thing that's astounding. The advances that are happening with CRISPR gene editing are so rapid that it's impossible to keep up with these advances. I mean, every time I turn around, there are new advances, and I'm just as surprised as you with what's happening, even though I spent quite a bit of time, reading about CRISPR-Cas9 and looking at, the preclinical studies and the early stage clinical studies that have been done. And this is a beautiful example of where this gene editing technology may take us. The thing about CRISPR technology compared to other types of gene editing technologies is it's very powerful and high precision, but it also is really inexpensive and very easy to use. In fact, if you're into these kind of things, you can go on Amazon and for under $200 buy a CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing kit that can allow you to do some very basic experiments with the gene editing technology on your kitchen counter. That's how easy it is to use. And so it's literally going to be transformative. Now, there's a number of issues still that need to be resolved. One of them is what are called off-target effects. Even though the gene editing is highly precise, there still are instances where the gene editing package will edit the wrong region of the genome. And of course, that's not a good thing.
Yes.
When you're introducing the vector, you can create, inflammatory responses and things like that. So there's still some pretty real technical issues to resolve, but we now really literally have the capability at our fingertips to replace defective genes with healthy genes, to turn genes off, to disable genes. This could be very useful in treating things like the HIV virus, for example, disabling the HIV DNA within genomes. We can, do editing where you're not replacing the gene, but just replacing a few nucleotides. So, I mean, the sky's the limit in terms of the biomedical applications.
You do spend a fair amount of time, Fuzz, talking about the ethics of embryonic stem cell research versus somatic cell research. Talk to us a little bit about the ethics of some of the work that's going on in the transhumanism movement. And a great primer there in the book, really about secular ethics and how they're really inadequate for this situation.
The complexity of it is these technologies can obviously be used for good, but even in a biomedical context, there's a number of ethical questions surrounding their usage. And those ethical questions become, I think, exacerbated, or there's ethical concerns maybe become exacerbated as we move from biomedical treatments to enhancements to then trying to evolve human beings into a posthuman species. And so the ethics is a real issue. And one of the concerns that I've seen expressed by secular bioethicists is we don't have the categories to actually properly deliberate on these emerging technologies. These technologies are emerging so rapidly and are creating brand new categories, that really, I think, confound a secular approach to bioethics. And so in the book, Ken Samples and I spend some time just highlighting why secular ethics is really ineffective at deliberating on how these technologies should be used. But instead of looking to a new system of ethics, we actually think an ancient system of ethics could be very useful, and that's an ethics built around the Christian worldview. and the idea of the image of God. Because of the image of God, we want to see human beings flourish. We want to minimize pain and suffering, but we also want to make sure that humans are not exploited, that we want to make sure that people that are marginalized actually have access to this technology, that there's a just distribution of these medical advances. And if they're used for enhancements, that everybody has equal access to those enhancements. And so the Christian worldview, because of the image of God concept, I think uniquely puts in place a framework that balances those two competing ideas. But then on top of that, the Christian worldview also has a very strong orientation towards scientific advance and promoting technology development. And so I think the Christian worldview has a lot to offer when it comes to these issues. But the issues are complex, and we tried in the book to shy away from saying these are the solutions to these ethical problems, but rather give people the tools to realize how the Christian worldview can help us deliberate on these. Just as an example for the complexity, there are people that are concerned, like when it comes to computer-brain interfaces, is this going to rob people of their dignity? Is this going to rob people of their humanity? Because as we begin to meld people with machines, where does that line end? Where does the human end and the machine begin? But on the other hand, for somebody who is locked in or somebody who is a quadriplegic, this technology could actually give them back their humanity. And so this is the complexity of the issue. Is it okay? The ethics. Is it okay to enhance human beings and let them use exoskeletons to enhance their physical strength if there's a legitimate reason to do that? Or is this maybe a line we shouldn't cross? So the issues are complex, but I think the Christian worldview has a lot to offer in the dialogue on how this technology should be used in a way that isn't condemning it, that isn't ignoring it, but is actually trying to foster the technology development in the best possible way so that humans genuinely flourish and nobody is marginalized or exploited in the process.
You wrote a great chapter entitled The Problem with Progress, and you point out that transhumanists often are not really honest with us and with themselves about the history of technology. And while it brings great benefits, it also brings with it its own set of problems that tend to beget more technology needed to fix those problems, and it's a vicious cycle.
One of the things that undergirds the transhumanist movement is this idea of the myth of progress. And it's kind of this narrative that as we develop new technologies, as we make scientific advances, those breakthroughs are going to inevitably lead to human progress, to improving the human condition. That's the view that ultimately undergirds transhumanism. But when you look at the history of technology, when you look at the philosophy of technology, scholars that work in these areas, pretty much to a person, agree that we have a very complex relationship with technology. It's an uneasy relationship because technology really defines, in many respects, who we are as human beings. We are techno-sapiens in many respects. Technology has allowed us to conquer every environment on the planet in such a way that we can live and flourish in these incredibly diverse environments as a human species. But yet, on the other hand, while technology does improve the quality of our lives, it's a double-edged sword. Every time there's an advance in technology that is designed to mitigate pain and suffering or to free us from the shackles of labor, we wind up becoming enslaved to that technology many times, or that technology creates a whole host of other problems that never existed before, and many times those problems are actually worse. And so what do? We try to develop new technology to solve those problems, and we wind up really exacerbating the problem. And of course, there's always unintended consequences that we can never foresee. And then when you throw in the sinful nature of human beings, that technology can also be misused for horrific evil. And so the more powerful the technology, the more transformative the technology, the more concern there is about the misuse of the technology or the unanticipated consequences. And so the fact of the matter is to try to place your hope and your trust in technology really ultimately is a false gospel. You're going to be disappointed. And so the transhumanism vision, as much as I think I can affirm what people are really desiring, I think the use of technology is not going to get us there. In fact, it may actually do the opposite. It may wind up creating such an existential crisis for humanity that it may drive us to our own extinction.
Is there any kind of regulation on this technology at this point in time, Fuzz?
Not really. I mean, what I typically am seeing is the scientific community trying to police itself and trying to put in place voluntary regulations that they are strongly encouraging people to, adhere to. There are some obviously regulations about what you can do experimentally with a human embryo. Beyond 14 days, you can't experiment with a human embryo. And so there are some, minimal regulations, but the technology is progressing so rapidly that, regulatory agencies can't keep up with the advances in such a way to put in place regulations. And in fact, there's this DIY biology movement that's emerging, where there are people who argue that these kind of technologies should not be limited to the academic and professional elites, but that every person should have the right to this technology. And there's a scientist by the name of Josiah Gaynor who is advocating this biology DIY movement, and he actually has injected himself in a public forum at a public, technology conference with a CRISPR gene editing package that disables the gene for myostatin, which is a gene that controls and regulates muscle development. And people have shown that in dogs and in racehorses, disabling that gene produces these animals that are almost grotesque in terms of their musculature. They look like an Arnold Schwarzenegger version of a dog or of a racehorse. And so this is a way to prove, again, how easy it is to use this. He injected himself with that gene editing kit with the idea of disabling his myostatin genes. Now, this was a publicity stunt, but what it's saying is that it doesn't take much for this kind of technology to wind up in a private sector where people can sidestep regulations if they do exist. And you're going to probably create an entire underground industry of people seeking CRISPR-Cas9 treatments to improve their intellectual capabilities, their physical strength, to try to extend their life expectancy, particularly people that have the financial means to do that. So, this is going to create a very interesting future when you may actually have legitimate medical practitioners trying to use this technology responsibly, and because of the inexpensive nature and the ease of use of the technology, have a whole shadow medical industry that is doing things that are probably ill-advised with the technology. And probably physicians are going to wind up having to step in at some point in the future to try to correct the mess that this DIY biology movement is going to create.
I just want to wrap up by asking what you and your co-author Ken Samples, what do you ultimately hope to impart to those who read your book, Humans 2.0?
The hope is really to put this on people's radar screens, particularly Christians, so that they understand that transhumanism is not this fringe idea, but it really is becoming a mainstream idea in the academy and is filtering down very quickly into the people on the street. And that we want Christians to understand the science behind transhumanism and to be cognizant of the ethical issues and begin to learn and know how to engage the ethical issues, but more importantly, how to see this as really an opportunity to build a bridge to the gospel. So the hope is that we respond positively and effectively to the transhumanist movement in a way that we are really engaging our culture, not withdrawing or not condemning.
Fuzz, I want to thank you for joining us today, and I hope that many of our listeners will go out and get this book with this incredible robotic hand on the front cover. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that reach back into the archives. And since that interview, I was just remembering that I had a guest in June, Dr. Francis Collins, and also a guest on CMDA Matters that's coming very soon, Dr. David Prentice. Both of my guests talked about this very subject, touching on transhumanism, involving human embryo research and chimeras. And so I think this webinar is so timely, and we appreciate our friends at Dallas Theological Seminary for working together to invite theologians and seminary students. And of course, we're inviting all of you, together with our trainees, to join us. The panel will be Dr. Rana, Dr. Bill Cheshire, and Dr. Ben Mitchell, hosted by Dr. Darrell Bach on August 14th. So I want to urge you to register today, cmda.org/DTS webinar, one word. I want to thank you so much for joining me today for this special bonus edition of CMDA Matters, where our vision is Christian healthcare professionals like you and me bringing the hope and healing of Christ to our world.
This podcast has been a production of the Christian Medical and Dental Associations. The opinions expressed by guests on this podcast are not necessarily endorsed by the Christian Medical and Dental Associations. CMDA is a nonpartisan organization that does not endorse political parties or candidates for public office. The views expressed on this podcast reflect judgments regarding principles and values held by CMDA and its members and are not intended to imply endorsement of any political party or candidate.